Welcome to the NEPM Media Lab. I'm Kiara Lee, youth reporter. We're interviewing authors from Western Massachusetts about books they've written for kids and teens. Today I'm here with Tiffany Jewell, who lives on the homeland of the Pocumtuck and Nipmuc. She is the author of The Anti-Racist Kid, a book about identity, justice, and activism. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you for having me.
I've read that you were an educator for nearly 2 decades, and you wanted to write this book for a long time, and that this was more of a response to the question that children asked you during your career, right?
Absolutely. So I taught, for about 2 decades, mostly in the Montessori School of Northampton, working with predominantly 6 to 9-year-olds. And every year we would do work on identity and justice and a lot of work on the history of racism and resistance. And I got lots of questions from kids every year, including my own. I have 2 kids who are almost 12 and 7. And the book was just kind of like percolating in my head for a long time. And after I wrote This Book is Anti-Racist, which is for like teenagers, I was like, well, let's go younger, because there's no reason why we as older folks should kind of gatekeep information. And so it's based, like, the book is probably about 50 questions that have all like come from kids, like real kids you like who are now your age and a little older too, but questions that I got in the classroom, that I get from my own kids, that as I continue to work in schools. And so when I look at the questions, like, I see very specific former students and kids in mind, which is really sweet too.
One of my questions is, what was the most challenging thing that you had to overcome while writing this?
Oh, there are a lot of like challenges in writing, and for me, writing is very different from working in the classroom, because working in the classroom, I was with kids all the time, and I had coworkers in other classrooms, and writing can be a very solitary, lonely thing, and I am not always good at like managing my time, and I get distracted really easily. So that, like, just kind of creating a set schedule and finding like writing partners, whether it's virtually or like going to like the coffee shop or the library to write. So I wasn't like just sitting in my room writing all alone. That was probably the hardest thing for me. The questions and the answers kind of came really easily with this book, which was really nice, but it's kind of like how do I get to the point of writing it?
Although you are providing resources for young readers and adults to help them understand what anti-racism is, can you define in like your own words, what do you determine anti-racism as?
Yeah, and it's a kind of like a definition, and something that keeps growing and changing, because the beautiful thing about being human is like we're dynamic and we're constantly growing and changing. And so for me, anti-racism is really just living in the world, actively resisting racism on a daily basis. You know, whether it's calling out stereotypes. You know, if my kid or somebody I know says something and I'm like, whoa, that's based on a stereotype and that's not true. Let's like rewind and look at that, to interrogating my own biases. Like, where did this come from? And then also like working and really advocating for just policies and laws and procedures and traditions. A lot of the work I do now is still in schools, and so working with educators to change the curriculum a little bit so it meets the needs of all the students and not just some of the students. And so it's really just like that constant like action and moving. And it looks different for everybody too, which is a really beautiful thing, because my anti-racism is a little different from your anti-racism and a little different from my husband's anti-racism.
And why do you feel like it's important for everybody to understand what it is?
Yeah. One of the things that I get a lot, because anti-racism has the word anti in it, folks are immediately like turned off a little bit, and they're like, whoa, like, we don't want to be against anything. But then you look at it and you're like, well, you need to be against racism, because it's in the definition I use in the book, it's personal prejudice and bias and the misuse and abuse of power by institutions. And so when we look at kind of that definition of racism, like, we need to make sure that the world is equitable and just for everybody, and not just like for the few who made up a lot of the laws and rules and things centuries ago, because we are a very different world now. And so for people to understand that anti-racism is like a very positive and powerful and empowering way of being is really important, because otherwise people are just going to be like, I don't know if I can do this. You know, like for some folks, they just see it as like going out and protesting, but that's not for everybody. Or they see it as like this very personal journey, when really like anti-racism is a whole big community event too, in a way.
I've noticed that the book was broken into 3 different sections: identity, justice, and activism. And it was a unique layout. Yeah. So I wonder, why did you choose this type of style?
So the layout and the sections, identity and justice and activism, are really I go back to like my teacher roots. And I learned about a framework called the anti-bias education, which was created in like the 1980s by Louise Durbin Sparks, Julie Olson Edwards, and a bunch of other folks. And it was a framework for teaching really young kids, like preschool age. And I used it when I was a preschool teacher. I taught young toddlers when I was in my 20s, and a lot of it is goals. Like, we want children to know who they are and to love themselves. And like, you can't really argue with that. Like, why wouldn't we want every child to love themselves? And so I took kind of those goals and looked at how it could relate to this book. And it turned out like, when we have identity, like, we're doing the work of understanding who we are. And if we don't know who we are, then we can't really move into the place of working with justice. And so once you know who you are, and you know who the people around you are, and you've like good and solid on all that, then we can move into like understanding how the world is just and fair, or unjust and unfair. And from there, then we can take action, and we can take action in different ways. And in the book, like, some of the things I share, like, you know, you can like write your senator and congressperson, or you can start a club and like get to know other kids who have the same feelings about whatever it is that you're experiencing, to like advocating for better curriculums in schools that meet everybody's needs.
What would you want readers to take away from this book?
Ooh. I wrote this book for young folks in particular, because when I was young and like witnessed and experienced racism at different levels, I knew what it was, but I didn't know how to talk about it. And I couldn't, like, I would go home and tell my mom, like, this thing happened today, but I didn't have the language to be like, that was really unfair and unjust. And so the book, I wrote it really wanting to share all of the things I've learned with young folks, so they don't have to wait until they're adults to be like, oh, this is how I need to change things, or this is like, this actually isn't okay. And so my hope is that for young readers, they'll feel more confident in talking and experiencing the world around them. And then for the adult readers, I really want them to trust that kids can do this work too. And that there's no reason why we as adults should be like, yo, you're too young for this, because you're never too young to be an anti-racist person.
Do you have any projects that you are working towards that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, yes. I have a lot of projects in the works. Some I'm not allowed to talk about, but I am allowed to talk about. I have a book coming out in January, and it's called Everything I Learned About Racism I Learned in School. And it's one I've been pretty much writing my whole life, right? Because I've been in school for forever. But it is part memoir. So I tell stories about my own schooling growing up in Syracuse, New York in the 1980s and 90s. And then it also includes stories from other authors and educators. So Joanna Ho, who wrote Isaac Kiss in the Corner, and Min Lei and Randy Rebai, like some of my favorite authors. They said yes, and they contribute stories and poems to it. And then it's also just a book that looks at different aspects of schooling that maybe we don't understand as like racist or anti-racist or whatnot, but to understand that we don't need to always do things the way they've always been done, and that we can create a beautiful vision for a school that is more just and equitable. So I'm really excited about that book. And then I'm also working on some picture books for kids, which is really exciting because I've never done picture books before. And they require a lot less words than the books for teens. So I'm excited about that too. I'll share it more when I'm allowed to.
Tiffany Jewell is the author of The Anti-Racist Kid, a book about identity, justice, and activism. Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. This was amazing.
It's a pleasure to have you. This is a production of the NEPM Media Lab. That's cut.
See, you're so good at this.
Thank you.
You got this.
I was so nervous while talking.
Oh.